Oh man, the box this came in was spherical. This is from ASUSTOR. I requested this. This is an 8-bay NAS that has 4 insanely powerful modern Zen cores and ECC memory out of the box. We're gonna take a look. This is the LOCKERSTOR 8 Gen 3, the AS6808T. RYZEN up to the challenge. I like that. Puns after my own heart. RYZEN embedded quad-core CPU, 16 gigs of DDR5 ECC SODIMM. Ooh, ECC SODIMMs. Those are rare. Dual USB 4, quad M.2 slots, PCIe 4.0 by 1, triple USB 3.2 Gen 2 by 1, dual 10 gigabit, dual 5 gigabit, and a 3-year warranty. This thing has got Forbidden Router VM host all over it. 4 cores. I would like to see more cores, but keep in mind the other systems that we've reviewed up till now only have 2 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores, but 2 performance cores. But these cores are far and away beyond what you would get from like a 1235 from Intel. These also do simultaneous multi-threading. Yeah, the box that this came in was spherical, so the top of this sort of poking out was worrying slightly, but everything looks fine on the inside. In the accessory box, we've got a power cord, several network cables, and all the mounting screws you could ever want. We'll put all that back. Nice Cat 6 cables, too. They did not cheap out on the network cables. Lockable drive trays. They are not toolless. Some of you commented that you like non-toolless drive trays. Okay, well here you go. Now this thing is definitely premium. It's got a built-in LCD screen on the front which will tell you useful, vital information, and you got 4 directional control switches here, the power button here. There's also a hidden built-in backup button. So this button is somewhat scriptable. We'll take a look at that in the software in a minute, but you can have another external USB hard drive plugged in here so that when you hit this button, your extra critical files can go to an external hard drive. This is really cool. Suppose you had a backup strategy where you had a friend that you let keep a hard drive, or you kept a hard drive in a safety deposit box at a bank. You can get 3 or 4 of those and keep them in a rotation. So you keep the external drive connected here, you hit this button, and then, you hit the button on a Friday night, and then on a Monday morning, you take your external drive to the bank safety deposit box, rotate the new one in, grab the old one. That is a perfectly reasonable strategy for backing up your personal files or even your small business files, because this is designed for high-end, usage. You could use it at home. Small business usage really is what it's meant for. Let's pop the top, because at the front, you've got access to your 4 3.5-inch bays, which are designed for SATA drives. I'm testing this with 28 terabyte mechanical hard drives. If you're looking for a deal on mechanical hard drives, you can check out serverpartdeals.com. They're not paying me to tell you that, but they did give me a bunch of hard drives for my home server, which I'm still pretty happy about. So go check them out because it was a good deal. The power supply is a Delta Electronics 250 watt power supply. And it's not a perfectly standard form factor, but I was able to locate a 80 plus bronze replacement on AliExpress. So that's maybe a good sign for replacement parts. Power supplies are a thing that would commonly die in these because power fluctuations and anything like that. But Delta is a good brand of power supply, so it's nice that they start with Delta in the first place. But you don't want your data to be locked up in here. It's really interesting that there's this 4-lane breakout adapter pre-installed giving you 4 M.2 bays, 1 lane per M.2. There is also a connection here where you can take off this cover and presumably have some sort of peripheral or other thing in lieu of your 4 M.2 bays here. But 4 M.2 is super useful because you could connect things for caching or storage or whatever, which is awesome. Hybrid flash and mechanical storage and dual 10 gigabit, well, dual 10 gigabit and dual 5 gigabit, that's pretty swanky. In case you're wondering, the installed 16 gig is also in a SODIMM slot, so thankfully that is upgradable. It's just a little more difficult to get to. So doing the teardown is pretty interesting. To get to the motherboard, you got to take the back off. It's got some screws. The screws that go for the power supply are different than the screws everywhere else, but check it out. There's a cooling heat pipe for the CPU. That's pretty awesome. So the CPU is going to get some direct and indirect airflow. And in order to remove the motherboard, you're going to have to remove the one screw that's holding the heat pipe with the heatsink on the back. And with that free, there's our motherboard. And here's our ECC DDR5 SODIMM, which I will get a close-up of. And it is indeed ECC, a Pacer. ECC DDR5 SODIMM 5600 CL46. That's some quality memory, like seriously, that's really good stuff. I'm glad that they chose that. So this has some significant design revisions and improvements since what I saw at Computex 6 months ago. So I'm glad that they gave it a little bit more time to bake. It's a Phoenix BIOS, it looks like. I don't see any external VGA or video headers, but Thunderbolt 4 can be DisplayPort alt mode, so we'll try that in just a moment. Otherwise, the layout on this board seems pretty genius. The backplane includes dual as media controllers. So this group of 4 drives appears to go through one as media controller, and this column of drives appears to go through the other as media controller mounted on the backplane. That suggests that this is a PCI Express interface as well, probably 2x2 interfaces. Definitely not 8 PCIe lanes in this connector, and that makes sense because even if you're doing dual actuator SATA hard drives here, that's only 500 megabytes per drive, with most normal SATA drives only doing 250 megabytes per second. So worst case scenario, each column of drives would top out at 2 gigabytes per second. That's 2 PCI Express lanes, plenty of bandwidth to get that done. Otherwise, this is a fantastic internal configuration, and I'm not sure, but I suspect that if you really were pressed, you could replace this with a 25 gigabit adapter, although I don't think that'll really be necessary. We're still working with a 250 watt power supply after all. Now, initial setup of this thing could not be easier. You just mount your hard drives. I've chosen to mount them in opposing columns rather than stacking up everything in one column because of how we discovered that it was wired electrically on the inside, basically distributing the load. Initialize NAS. Well, I don't mind if I do. Delete all data. Why, yes, I think I will. I've only got 4 of the 8 hard drives in here, but hey, that's going to be plenty because they're 28 terabytes. These are experimental drives. Soon, TM. The biggest bang per terabyte is definitely around the 20 terabyte mark. So 28 terabytes is a lot for a drive. After 5 or 10 minutes or so, once it's done initializing, it'll give you the IP address on the screen that it was able to obtain from DHCP. Normally on a system like this, you don't want to leave it configured as DHCP, or at least if you do, you want to configure MAC address reservation so the IP address doesn't change. Don't worry about it if that sounds like a foreign language. This is very easy to set up. It is plug and play. I plugged it into the network. It's telling me what it is on the network. If you want to call it done there, you can, just as a best practice. I'm telling you some things you should know. Well, let's take a look at things from the software LAN side of things. ASUSTOR has really updated their software a lot. So the first thing you want to do is check to make sure that there's an update. And if there is, deploy it. The easiest way to do that is the ASUSTOR Control Center software. If you're on Linux or you don't want to use that, you can do it from the web GUI. Note that a recent change is that the HTTP and HTTPS ports are port 8000. So you'll want to go run this thing, like connect to it on port 8000. You can get the IP address from the front panel, but log in with your web browser IP address :8000, or 8001 is the encryption. And it'll use a self-generated encryption certificate, so you'll get a security warning, but that's actually better than not using encryption at all. And there is a ton of options here, a ton of options for a ton of configuration, and even the off-label stuff can work really well with this. There's an external devices link, which will allow you to use external hard drives and printers, as well as battery backup, UPS, optical drives, can stream and rip movies. This doesn't have a built-in GPU, and there's not an easy way to add a GPU to this. So in terms of like off-label configuration, we'll talk about that, or installing another operating system, we'll talk about that. You do have to get really creative with this in order to do that. But the ASUSTOR software is pretty functional. The other thing is that this thing is 16 gigabytes out of the box. Because it is 16 gigabytes out of the box, you're going to run into much fewer limitations than you were previously. A lot of the time, these NAS devices only have 4 gigabytes of memory. This is 4 times that, and you can add more. And yes, 96 gigabytes of memory does actually work with two 48 gig DIMMs. Woo! Their official specs say up to 32 gigabytes, but you can do 96 gigabytes, assuming that you could find ECC UDIMMs. It will work without ECC UDIMMs, but again, there's not like a QVL list. You should get the same memory that they recommend. You don't want to, I mean, for spending the money on something like this, you really don't want to go too far off script, but I was having a lot of fun with it, and yeah, it does actually work. Now, in terms of initial setup, because I let the software do the automatic configuration and there were 4 drives in it, it's using 1 drive for redundancy and 3 drives with capacity. That is okay-ish for 4 drives, but because these are 28 terabyte drives, it's going to take over 30 hours, almost 2 full days, to re-image should a drive die, assuming that the other 3 are working perfectly. You could run a RAID 10 configuration with this, that's a striped mirror, and then up to 2 drives could fail. It is possible that 2 drives can fail and you would be hosed, but the chances of that are low-ish. And there's a performance benefit from running a striped mirror versus a RAID 5 type configuration. If you run 5 or 6 drives or 8 drives, a RAID 6 configuration would be my strong recommendation. To take a peek at storage, we can launch Storage Manager. We can see that it is a RAID level 5, and we're using drives 1, 2, 5, and 6. And we can see that there are no M.2s currently populated. However, I will be populating some T-Create 1 terabyte M.2s on our carrier card. You should also note that the performance will be lower while the RAID 5 is initializing. It's got to go through the whole drive. And guess what? That's going to take 30 to 48 hours because of the capacity of these drives. If you opt for something that's more in the 15 to 20 terabyte range, that synchronization time is going to be more on the order of 24 hours. And that's just because it physically takes that long to unwind the whole drive. Like if the drive is completely full, just reading the data, assuming that everything is operating completely normally, is going to take on the order of a day plus in ordinary capacity drives these days. That is when we're talking about trillions of bytes, that is mind-blowing, in my opinion. This thing also has a fairly extensive iSCSI facility, so if you would like to use one of these as an iSCSI host for backups or other things, you totally can do that. This is also a convenient way to run Proxmox. I know that I always like to demo running Proxmox on bare metal, and you can certainly do that with a Proxmox backup appliance, but with this, you can run Proxmox backup as a virtual machine, and then connect to and attach storage via iSCSI as one of the ways to deal with backup storage for your Proxmox cluster. So you're not actually running your VMs on this, but you are using the Proxmox backup appliance software in a virtual machine connecting to storage physically in this local box. So that is one option. The App Center for ASUSTOR is also pretty extensive, and there's a couple of agreements that you have to agree to. I'm quite inebriated. I can't agree to anything right now. But you can browse through them and select apps to install, or you can select all different other kinds of apps. You can install a TeamSpeak server on this. It can also be a syslog server, so you can do log forwarding from other devices. You can also install Nextcloud directly, only Office docs and data synchronization applications. Photo gallery, a UPnP media server, mini DLNA, and a sound server. Sounds good. It also supports Docker Engine Home Assistant. If you're using Iron Wolf drives, there's an Iron Wolf utility, which will give you a little bit more insight into drive diagnostics than just normal smart diagnostics that the ASUSTOR software does out of the box. Plex Media Server, of course. Jellyfin, I prefer these days. LibreSpeed speed test utility. I like this. It's not really good for me to do a speed test utility while we're doing this, but this also requires Docker, so we're going to install Docker as well, because I was going to do that, because why not? And these are the most popular applications. Portainer. Portainer is something we covered. You want to run Pi-hole immediately on this? Yeah, you're good to go. Portainer, that's good. That's something that I've been recommending for many years now. One application I want to call your attention to is the ASUSTOR PCIe mode switcher. So the add-in card that's installed right now takes the 4 lanes that are coming in and splits it up into 4 X1 lanes, which is actually a really awesome feature of that embedded RYZEN processor. But if you were going to install a 4-lane NIC or an extension cable to install the GPU temporarily, you want it to behave like one peripheral with 4 PCI Express lanes. You need this utility to reconfigure that slot in order to do that. We're going to go ahead and install that and take a look at it. And here's the section where I decided to go a little off-label, or a lot off-label as the case may be. First off, I wanted to validate the network speed. In order to do that, one of the things that I do is install iPerf3. There's actually a lot of other things that you do, because just because the network is fast enough doesn't mean the entire rest of the machine is fast enough. But if the network can't keep up, or you use all the CPU trying to keep the network fed, then it could be a problem. Well, good news, this thing can easily manage 20 gigabit. In fact, it tops out at about 60 gigabit, which, you're going to be hard pressed to get, even if you fully kitted this thing out with 4 NVMe and 8 hard drives. But that also means that you could run virtual machines on this in VirtualBox. There's also a built-in NetData client. NetData, if you're not familiar with it, you can install it on Proxmox and basically everything. You get a lot of telemetry about your running systems. So definitely recommend installing that. You can run your 3D printer with Octoprint, Obsidian. We've covered videos on Obsidian. Obsidian is very nice if you get into that for managing your brain. Under all apps, I finally found the Tailscale app. It's got a beta version of the Zero Tier app, so if you prefer Zero Tier, you do have an option, but it has Tailscale. You can enroll it in your Tailnet immediately, and then all of the apps and everything else that you have on this will be available no matter where you are without you having to forward ports or anything. If you're on Starlink where you don't have a public internet IP address, Tailscale will make it so that you can use web services on this anywhere you are in the world, even over a Starlink connection, assuming that, this is at home on your Starlink connection. So you can stream movies from halfway around the world, even though your only internet connection might be an ISP like Starlink that only has carrier-grade NAT, where you don't have a true public IP address. And this one device being able to do all of that, it is cool for small apartment dwellers and that sort of thing, even though it is a little pricey. And it's not really quite as flexible as some of its competitors. I also tried VGA. I've got the SFF A4000, which you wouldn't want to run this in here anyway, even if it does actually work at the LSPCI level. It doesn't turn this into a computer. You don't get a BIOS screen or anything like that, at least with this VGA adapter. I also tried an A1000. An A1000 would be a better fit. This GPU can use up to 75 watts. Our power supply is only 250 watts. There's not enough margin in the power supply to really go hog wild when you're doing a setup like this. Technically, your NVMe can use, the Samsung ones go out of spec and use 15 watts at peak. This doesn't actually bump up against those kinds of limitations because each NVMe only has one lane. So that Samsung NVMe that can do its little 14.2 watt excursion in terms of power, never actually going to do it because it's never actually running that fast. And even trying a couple of different extension cables and a couple of different configurations, I was never able to get a post screen or interact with this like as if it was a computer the way that some of the other NAS devices on the market work. So I would not recommend installing an alternative operating system to this. Officially, ASUSTOR sort of stopped supporting that all the way back in 2021. They would tolerate it, but it's really not super well supported. And it's too bad too, because everything else about the platform is pretty standardized, and the CPU is really nice. Open Adventure by it's Colossal Cave Adventure by Eric S. Raymond. This is amazing. It's just neat. ASUSTOR also gives you a breakout for their official applications. So ClaimAV, you can do antivirus at the NAS level. You also get snapshots. So like if you get ransomwared, you could roll back to an earlier snapshot if you have snapshots enabled. Something you should look into. FFmpeg is here, and it runs pretty well on the processor, but because there is no graphics facility to help accelerate that, it's not as fast as it could be on some other things. ASUSTOR does have other devices that have a built-in GPU, so that is an option, but this is not really an option for this genre of embedded Ryzen processor, it seems. Like ASUSTOR couldn't, it doesn't make sense on this to target for this particular embedded processor. So I get it. That's not anything that, ASUSTOR didn't do in terms of engineering. So it's reasonable. It is possible to also enable SSH on this. So if you're comfortable using the terminal, you can SSH into this and have low-level SSH access to be able to do some things, which is what I used for doing some of the drive benchmarking and actual performance tests. In addition to iSCSI, you can also use this as an NFS target, which is awesome, but you'll need to go to Services and enable NFS. Fun. And Apple File Protocol. Apple File Protocol is getting a little long in the tooth. Even Apple sort of recommends using SMB, which is a sort of a Windows technology, but it is open source. Another fun thing about this is that it supports SMB multi-channel. We were some of the first people on the internet to say, hey, why is nobody using SMB multi-channel? It should be enabled by default. And ASUSTOR does actually enable SMB multi-channel by default, which is fantastic. So if you have, an 8 or more port, sufficient number of 10 gigabit ports, you can just plug in both 10 gigabit ports, and then any clients that you have on your network will use multiple channels to connect to the NAS. Now that's not really useful unless you have workstations that also have dual 10 gigabit, but if you have multiple 10 gigabit workstations, it will automatically use multiple 10 gig connections, and so there's less contention. It's not as good as true hardware bonding, but SMB multi-channel is a perfectly reasonable solution to having more bandwidth. So 20 gigabits also about what you could expect at the very top end from a combined NVMe plus mechanical storage solution, because at the end of the day, you still only have 8 hard drives. And in a best case scenario, you're only going to be getting 2 to 3 gigabytes per second from those mechanical hard drives. Real world performance is going to be considerably less because mechanical hard drives. But M.2 SSDs, you got 4 of them. You can do about a gigabyte per second per drive, 4 gigabytes total, read and write in both directions. So that's a pretty substantial amount of bandwidth. So yeah, it's well balanced for the amount of bandwidth in the system and the network connectivity and everything else. And if you do run virtual machines, you can dedicate some of your network connections for those specific virtual machines, which is awesome. There's an important distinction to understand is that this quad-core CPU is truly an industrial CPU. I'm also happy to report that the 96 gigabyte of memory configuration worked fine. I'm also happy to report our Thunderbolt enclosure works. Let's take a closer look at that from the terminal. I was very curious because it didn't initialize the PCIe video, but it is detecting PCIe video in LSPCI. Oh, and if you're not sure about enabling SSH, you can come to the terminal section SSH and enable SSH on port 22. When the thing is in like first install mode, it actually also has SSH open, but it's on port 9222 by default, which is interesting because you could set it up on the network if you set one of these up remotely. You'll also need to use the ASUSTOR PCIe mode switcher because it won't initialize any PCIe device correctly if it is not in the non-default. Normally it's in the M.2 SSD mode where it'll hold 4 M.2s, but you'll have to switch it over to this for that. But then once you do that, it will be detected correctly as a PCIe device. And more exciting than that, the Radeon 7 that I've got in that external Cooler Master Thunderbolt enclosure. If you want to check out the Thunderbolt enclosure, you can check out the separate Cooler Master video that I did on that. But look, it's there. It's in LSPCI. It detects it. It knows it's there. It doesn't initialize it for any kind of function to do with the actual host operating system. Like getting into BIOS or configuring BIOS options on these, as is possible on some other ASUSTOR NAS devices, is a little tricky. It might be possible to get at it from a serial header, but I didn't test that for this video. Clearly, they don't mean for you to do this, and so this is not something that I would recommend even for off-label uses. But you could use the PCIe device for other things, barring in mind the power supply limitation. Now, you'd be delighted to know that when I did just basic iPerf 3 tests, like how fast is the interface on this, and keep in mind as a practical matter, you'll never see this, but if I peg all 4 of these CPUs, 8 threads, how fast can I go? And the answer is about 50 gigabit, which is not bad. That is shockingly good. This is wildly impractical because you would have to run not a lot of drives in here. You don't really have the lanes or the power budget, PCIe lanes, to run a full 50 gigabit connection, but this thing had no problem saturating 20 gigabit. Now, mechanically, your storage and your NVMe, you would have to max those out in order to achieve 20 gigabit. But you can get over 10 gigabit pretty easily, even with a modest configuration. Our base configuration here that I started with, 4 mechanical drives and a couple of NVMe, yeah, 10 gigabit is no problem. And that's really what this is designed for. For running virtual machines on this, there's a VirtualBox, which you can install from the App Store. I don't love VirtualBox as a solution, if I'm being honest, but this is the easiest way to be able to run Windows or something like that. And do note, if you're going to do that, you're going to need at least 16 gigs of memory, which is an upgrade. But really, I'd recommend that you upgrade, 32, 48, 64, 96 gigabytes of memory in this would be my recommendation. And you should really know what you're doing if you're planning to run one or more virtual machines via VirtualBox. You've only got 4 cores to work with. You really would be better off with something like Docker, because Docker is a containerization service. It shares resources better than a virtual machine. And the Docker and Portainer facilities that are provided here are really top notch. Oh, sorry, at least 32 gigabytes of memory. Now, about that memory upgrade, you can mix DIMM sizes. Just because you shove a 48 gig DIMM in there doesn't mean that you have to take it completely apart and shove the DIMM in on the other side for a total of 96. I added a 48 gig DIMM to the existing 16 gig ECC DIMM, and it booted up and detected it, and everything worked fine. This got me thinking, what would happen if I mix ECC and non-ECC memory? Well, it works. But when you mix ECC and non-ECC memory, it seems as though the ECC memory is reported differently, and I'm not sure that the performance is really there. So if you do mix DIMM sizes, at least try to get ECC DDR5 if you do that. I'm not sure about this with mixed ECC and non-ECC memory. I mean, it does work, but I think you end up with the memory that supports ECC not actually doing ECC anymore when you do that. But hey, that's a quick, easy way to add this, 64 gigs of memory, or to bring this thing up to 64 gigs of memory with the relatively inexpensive 48 gig DIMMs. So that's a yes on Thunderbolt, but no on using the Thunderbolt to get to the BIOS or configure a native display. You could use it in Linux, but somewhat limited. Can you pass it through to a virtual machine? No. Well, maybe, but not recommended. Also at level 1, we have the Minisform MS01 compatibility database, and I'm happy to add this to that as well via its USB 4 interfaces. That's right, they added support. I was sure that they didn't, but some engineer inside ASUSTOR, good job. Good job, ASUSTOR Thunderbolt engineer who did the software to qualify that. You saw my video, didn't you? I know you did. Good job. This is amazing. So it's getting added to the MS01 database, and that is a weird use case. That also works with Macs. Like, historically, older Macs would do this over FireWire. And so, there's a whole Mac interesting story about networking over FireWire, and it was amazing, and Apple's kind of forgotten its roots, and it's not as cracked up as it used to be. It's not as cracked up as it used to be on Linux either. I mean, doing this under Proxmox is not, super amazing reliable. But for a home lab, stacking a couple of MS01s on top of this and still having the network interfaces, that's pretty swanky, because you can use your Thunderbolt as the storage network. I'm sorry, USB 4, Thunderbolt compatible, as your storage network, and then your network interfaces for all of your other network connectivity, backup connectivity, managing VMs, and all that sort of stuff. So that's exciting. That's a lot of fun. That's great. Fabulous. So there we go. The next generation of ASUSTOR's LOCKERSTOR, 8 bays, also available in some other bay configurations depending on how many mechanical hard drives you want. I think 8 is the sweet spot when you're talking about this sort of stuff, but the 6 bay is probably also a sweet spot in its own right, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. And I really love that this thing is upgradable, at least with the memory, and some connectivity here, which is interesting. So all in all, ASUSTOR has done a pretty good job with this. It is a little bit more focused in terms of what it does, in terms of an appliance, and so a little less flexible if you want to go off reservation and start doing your own stuff. But there's no denying the true enterprise ECC platform with a truly, embedded enterprise CPU from AMD is a winning combination. And I'm glad that ASUSTOR took the time to engineer that into this solution, as opposed to, bolting a mobile CPU into this space, which doesn't really properly support error correcting memory anyway. Error correction in 2025 is not a huge deal. It's kind of important. It's important to me. DDR5 has some built-in error correction, but this is the whole enchilada. This is the full-fat, end-to-end detection and correction platform software, whole 9 yards. That's nice to see. The only thing missing is we need to get RYZEN installed and available in the App Center so that you can do RYZEN ECC event monitoring. I'm looking at you, engineer that properly did Thunderbolt connections and Thunderbolt networking. Get on it. I'm Wendell, Level 1. I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forums if you have any questions about this, or if there's anything that I missed or anything like that. Fun times! I love playing with this kind of hardware. All right, I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.